Thank you. This is for Brian. Those densities of the mosque were not that high, but half, I guess, of what we would have in North America in a assembly facility. My question relates to the social groupings. Is your colleague looking into the relationships between or among people going to a mosque, for example, or going to a public place? Are there differences among the genders in that respect, that they would tend to be with a group of their colleagues or something? And how would that affect, aside from the physical matters of garb and so on, how can you see that being different in other cultures compared to ours, for example? And again, social clustering is the issue there.
Good question, Jake. Michelle is looking at that, and to a certain extent, because of some of the religious and social customs, men tend to group separately from women, so you don't get the interaction, the same multi-gender groups in all situations. When you're just among the Saudis, what gets interesting is when you get into some of the malls and other public spaces that have a mix of Western culture and Saudi culture. Now you have different types of social interactions happening within the broader group. So we're trying to collect data to see what those types of different group interactions with the bigger group might have.
Other questions? The gentleman with the move was first.
I have a question for Lynn. I'm just wondering, you talk about age as a factor, or years of service, I guess it was. And I'm just wondering, to the degree that these guys are, when you talk about firefighters, you're essentially maybe you're selecting out for basically adrenaline junkies. It's almost like the guys that don't get off on that excitement have left the job. And so that might predispose your sample to this group that, as they get older, those are the guys who love it because of that. And I've run into that with some of my own conversations with firefighters and people working in coal mines. They get off on that stuff, and that's what keeps them there.
So the adrenaline junkies keep going?
Yes. Where the other people who don't get off on it realize the risks and maybe move on to other professions.
Yeah, we are quite aware that there could be some issues with the samples. Not only could the adrenaline junkies be sticking in with this kind of environment, but also the ones where it's been too much for them might not be included in our sample because they've left the job, either they've retired, gone on long-term sick leave, or just felt this is not the area for them. So it is quite possible that our sample might not be representative of all firefighters, but just a particular type who like that kind of environment.
Hi, Lynn. Michelle Hall. Also on your sample, are there any female firefighters in your sample, and is there any way you can extract that data, and would you expect to see any differences?
We do have some female firefighters, but it was something around the region of 5.
Oh,
so, as much as we would love to look into gender differences, that's quite indicative of the UK population of firefighters. It is something like, I think, around about 5–6% of firefighters there are female. Our colleagues in the other countries, particularly in Germany, with the Coordinate Centre, they've been looking at that. So obviously, with a larger data set, they've got more females, but it's still around about 5% versus 95%.
We had a lot of difficulty in getting people to participate in the study, and that was disappointing. And there are a number of firefighters in this room who helped us and went out of their way to help us, and we appreciate that. But compared to the other countries, we had the poorest response, so it was a bit disappointing, the degree of response we had.
It could be. I mean, just to add to that, we found one good way of recruiting was there's some social networks, UK Fire Forum in particular. This is a forum where people can log in anonymously and air their views about their profession without fear of comeback. So it's quite possible that, because we also recruited through the help of the CFOA, and it could be that if you have your bosses telling you to fill this out, perhaps they might worry about anonymity. I mean, we did try to stress to them it was an online survey, or they could contact us directly for paper copies and send it back to us directly, but there still may be some issues with recruiting regards to that.
We also had a lot of bureaucratic grief in the UK trying to get firefighters to work with us on this, to the point where some of the questions were censored. And so our survey was different in slight ways to the other surveys in Europe, because our chief fire officers, for whatever reason that they decided, some of the questions were inappropriate, whereas in the rest of Europe it was fine.
Brian Huskins, Oklahoma State University. Ed, I was wondering if you've looked at, for the pre-evacuation times, have you considered when people are in isolation as compared to what the other people around them are doing? So if one person's sitting there, everyone else, oh wait, I'm not supposed to get up, it must be something else, compared to someone immediately jumps up, then everyone around them follows suit.
Yeah, that didn't tend to happen when one person got up. It didn't mean that everyone else was going to get up. And certainly in the UK study, where we had some people who were isolated in rooms on their own, or with two people, say, they took an inordinate amount of time to react to the alarm. And so they did a lot of action tasks in that they ignored, once they had a relatively short notification time, so they knew the alarm was going on, but then they engaged back in their work. And then they would talk to each other, so lots of information going backwards and forwards, and then they'd get up, and a couple of them actually went out and looked into the corridor to see what was going on, and then even when they could see people, went back and said, well, okay, we can continue doing work. So if they were isolated, then on the whole they tended to take longer, but we didn't see the reverse of that. Just because you were in a large room of people and you saw other people going, you'd immediately pack up, especially for the people that were engaged in computer activities.
Because that's been observed in other studies previously, that there are definite group interactions when you have a lot of people in the same space together. But it can cut either way. Sometimes you get one person who's very charismatic and gets people going quickly, and sometimes it can be the other way around.
The really interesting thing that we found, I mean, I couldn't present all the results, and we haven't presented any of the cross-cultural comparisons, but it's quite striking. There is statistically significant differences in terms of the response phase behaviours between all of the cultures that we looked at. Statistically significant figures, differences, and striking in some cases, how rapidly in some cultures people responded to the alarm. And it goes counter to cultural prejudices that you might have, what you might think, in terms of which culture might react quicker than the other. The UK, for example, was one of the slowest.
Susan Johnson from Canada. I wonder if the frequency at which fire alarms are tested is a factor. I mean, I noticed when I checked into the hotel that I got a notice that they check the fire alarm. The fire alarm rings every week. Well, I'm not used to that in Canada.
Yeah. Well, that's a good question. That's one of the things we surveyed beforehand, before we actually selected the sites, and which we checked with. So we didn't want to go to places where there were necessarily frequent alarms, and this goes back to the fire culture. We wanted to try and keep the fire culture as similar as well. And certainly in the three cultures, the Turkish, the Czech and the Polish case, they don't have anywhere near the frequent fire alarm testing that we have. In fact, it might even be on a yearly cycle. And then and so that helped us select the countries and the areas. And in addition to that, we sampled all the people with the survey afterwards, and we asked them, have they ever heard an alarm in this building before? And if so, when was the last time? And so the vast majority of people hadn't heard an alarm in the building for 5-6 years, or in fact, not at all, effectively. because they weren't in that place for that long. So the frequency of alarms didn't influence, we believe, the populations, apart from the UK, where there's a potential where we have more frequent trials. But again, in the survey that we did, because we did the evacuation fairly early in the academic year, all the new students certainly hadn't heard the alarm before in the building. So we had a pretty uniform across the whole sample set of frequency of hearing alarms, certainly in that building.
So one last question, the gentleman on the end of the row there. The grey suit.
Ian Sanderson from Glasgow Caledonian University. We've actually just this year repeated some video recording of reactions to students in an evacuation in a library facility. It was 5 years on since it was first done. And part of it was to do a comparison with what had happened 5 years ago. The building had actually just been opened, and what happened today. And the thing that we found slightly worrying is lack of staff assistance even to a student with a temporary disability. A student who was going about in crutches and not a single member of staff approached to give assistance. There was a general delay overall, which was reflective in what had happened just after the building had first opened. But you know, that information is available if you want to have a look at it. You know, so
that'd be interesting. In our study, none of the alarm-activated studies in the 3 countries, Poland, Turkey, and Czech Republic, none of the alarm-activated evacuations had staff intervention at all in getting the students to respond. In the UK, in the London study at Greenwich, the population was in 2 parts. Part of the population had only reacted to the alarm, and the other part of the population that reacted to the alarm and staff intervention. And it was the population that was taking a really long time also had the staff intervention. So they actually needed the staff intervention to get going. But in the other three studies, there was no staff intervention at all. All the students were reacting to the alarm.
Okay, well, I think we've got to call a halt to it there, so we can continue outside the meeting. And good discussion. I'd like you to thank the speakers.